Alrighty, thanks, Indigo. Hey guys, I'm Raphael. I'm currently a third-year Bachelor of Economics student at UNSW. Ooh, someone else is here. Yeah, and I've been having a lot of fun working as a research assistant for one of the professors here. And actually today we're gonna talk about some of the stuff we're doing. So let's get started. I'm just gonna share my screen real quick. All right, you guys all see that? Cool. All right, so today we're going to talk about some research I've been doing with Joshua Gans at the Rotman School of Management and Richard Holden, one of our faculty here at the School of Economics. But first, there's a lot of background info to get through to appreciate the problem as well as the solution we've come up with. So I'm sure you've all been hearing plenty about blockchains, cryptocurrencies, NFTs, hodling. Some of you might even have heard of DAOs and DEXs or dug into the technical workings of these things. So what's with all the hype? There are definitely lots of heavy-handed marketing strategies, get-rich-quick honeypots, and meme-driven assets in the space capitalizing on people's greed and inexperience. It's one of those things where everyone seems to be FOMOing into it, but very few people actually know what's going on or why blockchain is an important innovation. Sturgeon's law definitely applies here. 90% of everything you'll find in the crypto space is crap. In my opinion, the real value proposition of blockchain is that it allows us to make verified transactions against a digital state of the world, where this state is backed by a tamper-proof, censor-resistant, transparent public record. And we get all of this without having to place trust in any one actor in the system. Rather, it uses the market system and incentive design to ensure that it is in every participant's best interest to act truthfully. Later generation blockchains support the all-important smart contracts, which are pieces of code that can be executed in a verified manner, subject to the same security guarantees as simple money transactions. Why is this important? Let's talk briefly about the Great Financial Crisis. It is argued that the public's abiding trust in centralized institutions and their lack of operational transparency that contributed significantly to the subprime mortgage bubble, which played a central role in the GFC. With this undeserved trust and a severe lack of accountability mechanisms, bankers were freely able to manipulate ledgers and misrepresent the value of assets they were selling. Under an immutable public ledger, it would be impossible to tamper with accounts and easy for anyone to verify a financial statement. Speaking more generally, human-dependent institutions are difficult to scale. As total assets under management grows, so grows the incentive for an agent within the organization to abuse their privileges, or for outside agents to exploit weaknesses. Greater organizational complexity provides more cover behind which shady business practices can hide. Monitoring, accountability, and audit costs scale with complexity, and even then, fraud runs rife. Using smart contracts, we can build economic and political institutions that scale at the rates of technological progress and are essentially fully trustworthy. In fact, there's a huge experiment going on in the crypto space right now in which financial products and services are being built from the ground up using smart contracts, owned and controlled by nobody. Collectively, these form the system of decentralized finance, or DeFi for short. There are stable currencies like DAI, borrowing and lending platforms like Aave, options and futures trading platforms like DYDX, and insurance providers like Nexus Mutual, to name a few. Anyway, let's quickly go over two important blockchain platforms you should know about. The first is Bitcoin, the original blockchain founded by Satoshi Nakamoto in 2009. Bitcoin enables a network of computers, also known as nodes, to collectively agree on the state of its transaction ledger without relying on any kind of central authority. It does this by using a method we call proof of work consensus. Now, before I get into how it works, I want to first give you a mental image. The blockchain is essentially a transaction ledger, and each block in the blockchain is like a page in the ledger. Now, when I want to send Bitcoin to someone, I first post a transaction to the network. And this transaction gets forwarded to all the participating nodes and stored in a list of pending transactions, known as the memory pool, or mempool for short. Think of it like a to-do list of sorts. Meanwhile, these nodes are also hard at work crunching numbers, competing to solve a mathematical puzzle. The first node to crack this puzzle and present their solution, or proof of work, gets to dictate the next block, that is, write transactions from the mempool into the next page of the ledger. As to what transactions get included in the block, the node typically picks those with the highest transaction fees attached as a way to pay the node to include your block over all the others. Sorry, your transaction over all the others in the block. To further incentivize nodes to contribute their computational resources to the network, the first transaction in every block implies a transfer of some amount of Bitcoin to the winning node. This is why we have Bitcoin miners, people who purchase and run specialized hardware to try and crack the puzzle before everyone else does in order to reap the block reward. This works out for the Bitcoin network though, because the more participants in the network, the harder it is for any individual actor to mount an attack and compromise the truthfulness of the ledger. Now, Bitcoin has many, many issues, but the relevant one here is that being only a payments ledger, it is severely limited in the types of institutions it can support. Enter Ethereum. Conceived by Vitalik Buterin in 2013 and released 2 years later, the Ethereum network embodies something far more general, a decentralized computer. Here, transactions are not limited to monetary transfers, but can represent the execution of arbitrary logic. The kinds of logic that Ethereum executes are defined by smart contracts that we as users deploy to the network. Once again, smart contracts are pieces of code that can read and write data from the ledger, as well as transfer wealth between accounts. There's nothing too different between a smart contract and any old computer program, but being run on the blockchain, they confer one significant advantage. Smart contracts allow us to implement economic mechanisms where at least one party is required to be trustworthy. Take escrow systems, for example. Let's say I want to purchase a domain name like raphael.xyz from you. I don't want you to run off with my money without giving me the domain, and you don't want me to run off with the domain without paying you. A concierge escrow service minimizes this risk by taking temporary custody of both the payment and the domain. Upon receiving both, the escrow service will disperse the funds to you and transfer me the domain. At present day, one might go to a licensed escrow provider like escrow.com for this type of service. However, as escrow.com is a for-profit company providing a valuable product, they've chosen to charge 6.5% on the first $5,000 of escrow and 0.5% thereafter on any given transaction. On top of this, there's a 3% payment processing fee. We know from economics that transaction costs, such as that paid to an escrow provider, constitute economic inefficiency. On a current generation blockchain, it is quite easy to deploy a smart contract that provides the same service, but with transaction costs at less than a cent. So that was our crash course overview on blockchains and smart contracts. And just gonna pause here. Does anyone have questions? We good to go? I will take that as a yes. All right. So now we get to the main topic of the day, which I will illustrate by example. Let's say that there is a contract with some funds stored in it, and anyone who presents it with a certain secret password is able to withdraw those funds. Logistically, this is done with a one-way hash function so that the hash of the correct password can be publicly stored in a contract, but is practically impossible to reverse engineer. Let's say that you have the password, which entitles you to 1 Ether, which is stored in the contract. That's about 2,500 USD. Normally, if you were to do this kind of deal in person, you just show up with the password, redeem your money, and then head home. However, as all activity on the blockchain is publicly known, there is a slight catch here. Remember that posted transactions don't get immediately written to the blockchain, but first enter the mempool as a pending transaction. Before your call to the contract gets included in the block, it is possible for an attacker to read your transaction from the mempool, along with the secret password, and repost a similar transaction with a higher fee. And as nodes typically include transactions on a fee maximizing basis, the attacker's transaction lands first, robbing you of your funds. This attack belongs to a class of attacks known as front running. In the paper, we propose a mechanism design solution to this problem, where the subgame perfect equilibrium is such that third parties do not find it rational to attack, and the legitimate claimant gets their funds. If you don't know what a subgame perfect equilibrium is, think of it as a description of what people will actually do in a situation. So how do we accomplish this? We actually drew our inspiration from a passage in the Bible, known as the Judgment of Solomon. It is written that two women came before the king with a baby, each claiming the baby to be hers. While they were arguing with each other, King Solomon had his servants fetch him a sword and proclaimed, "Cut the living child in two, and give half to one and half to the other." Upon hearing this, the true mother came forward and said, "Give her the baby, don't kill him," while the other woman was indifferent. Thus, the true mother was identified and given custody of the baby, and all was well. What's the takeaway here? While both women's first best outcome is receiving the baby, the true mother would rather the baby live on elsewhere than have the baby die, while the other woman doesn't care if she doesn't get the baby. Noting the similarity between the preferences of the true mother and the fake, and those of the legitimate claimant and the attacker, we designed the Solomonic Mechanism, which works based on each agent's preference over the second and third options. In our front-running scenario, we assume that the legitimate claimant would prefer the funds to be frozen than go to the attacker, perhaps for reasons of justice or reciprocity, while the profit-minded attacker is indifferent between the legitimate claimant getting the funds and the funds just being frozen. So instead of using the naive withdrawal mechanism, we introduce a new setup with a claim stage and an optional challenge stage. The claim stage begins when the first claim is accepted by the contract and lasts for some predetermined period of time. If by the end of the claim stage, there are no competing claims, the sole claimant is able to withdraw the funds. If there are multiple claims, then a challenge period is initiated. All claimants now have the opportunity to abort the contract or to do nothing. If an abort is given, the funds get frozen in the contract and are essentially lost. If there are no aborts by the end of the period, then the claimant associated with the last arriving claim gets to withdraw the funds. We allow the last place claimant the possibility of getting the funds so that an attacker cannot benefit from getting their transaction in first. And if an attacker somehow gets their claim in after the legitimate claimant does, the legitimate claimant will find it rational to abort in order to prevent the attacker, who is in last place, to get the funds. Thus, no matter how the dice fall, an attacker will not be able to get the funds when faced with a rational legitimate claimant. So far, of course, we've ignored transaction costs. Remember that every transaction comes with a fee to incentivize the block proposing node to include the transaction. This turns out to be a good thing because it makes the analysis of the mechanism more compelling. To see why, imagine you are the attacker in the challenge stage. Without transaction fees, you are indifferent between calling abort or surrendering the funds to the legitimate claimant. But if you have to pay to make an abort transaction, you'd actually strictly prefer to just let the legitimate claimant take the funds. To give you a better sense of what's going on, here is a simplified game tree describing our situation. In the first place, the legitimate claimant can choose between claim and don't claim. If they choose don't claim, then the funds stay in the contract and both parties walk away with nothing. If they choose claim, then we enter the claim stage, where an attacker can choose whether to attack. If they don't attack, the legitimate claimant can take the funds and leave. If they do attack, we enter the challenge stage. In this game tree, we assume that the attacker's transaction lands first. Thus, the attacker must choose whether to abort. Either way, they don't get the funds. But if they abort, they have to pay an additional transaction fee. So they choose not to abort, and the legitimate claimant can walk away with the funds without any additional cost. The unique subgame perfect equilibrium in this game is for the legitimate claimant to make their claim, the attacker not to attack in the first place, and should they attack, choose not to abort the contract. If we assume the alternative scenario where the attacker ends up in the last place and the legitimate claimant must choose whether to abort, they will, as long as the transaction fee is smaller than the psychological cost of letting the funds go to the attacker. Well, they will, as long as the transaction fee is smaller than the psychological cost. So that is where C is less than theta, where theta is the cost of the funds going to the attacker, and C is the cost of a transaction. Thus, the unique subgame equilibrium is again for the legitimate claimant to make the claim, for the attacker not to attack, and this time for the legitimate claimant to abort the funds should they enter this subgame. Now, another assumption we made is that F minus 2C, or the value of the funds minus the cost of making claim and withdrawal transactions, is greater than 0. In high value contracts on a mature blockchain, we'd expect this to be true. But as some of you may know or have personally experienced, transaction fees are sky high these days. For example, deploying an instance of the Solomonic contract recently cost me about 90 USD. Thus, this mechanism is far more successful when transaction fees are low, both because it will make the funds more worth the trouble of withdrawing and make the threat of a legitimate claimant aborting the funds in this subgame more credible. And that is my presentation. Thank you, guys.
Cool.
And please, if there are any questions, I went through a lot, ask them.
There's one in the chat from Lee.
Okay, great. Isn't that added transaction cost if it aborts and the true payer and seller keep getting frozen? Sorry, can you clarify that question?
I meant in terms of time, like if you have to wait between the stages, isn't that a transaction cost?
Oh yeah, it is. But I mean, usually so on Ethereum, the block time is about 15 seconds. And I think 15 seconds is pretty short. In our demo, which we recorded like a video and wrote up a whole Medium post and everything in companion with the paper. We set the claim stage duration and the challenge stage durations to both be 60 seconds. And I mean, 60 seconds is, while not nothing, already a lot shorter than, the amount of time it takes traditional contracts to kind of be processed, which could be like days or weeks.
Makes sense. Cool. Nice presentation.
Thanks. Anything else, guys?
Do you think you could maybe just re-explain the initial problem and why, like, how is it that an attacker can, what is it exactly that they're doing? Are they taking the funds that are being transferred?
Yeah, okay, so remember, right, you have some secret password, right? And there's this smart contract that contains some funds and it has this hash, right? And if you present a secret password and it hashes to the hash that is stored in the contract, then the contract will transfer you the funds, right? The thing is, right, there is a delay between when you post your transaction and when it actually kind of hits the contract, right? And this delay is basically like those 15 seconds, right, where transactions get collected in the memory pool, right? Remember, this is kind of like the to-do list in between blocks, right? And in these 15 seconds, a mempool bot, some attacker can read these pending transactions and then extract your secret password from the transaction and then post another one with a higher transaction fee, right? And remember, because these nodes, these miners, they just want to maximize their transaction fees. They don't really care which transactions get included. They're just going to include the transaction with a higher transaction fee. So even though you're the one who had the secret password, someone kind of like stole it from you and presented it more enthusiastically. And because of that, they get to take the funds instead of you. Right? And the Solomonic mechanism has an equilibrium in which this does not occur, or its unique equilibrium is such that this does not occur.
Is there, like, I'm not sure what's the case where you wouldn't be able to just include your public blockchain address in the withdrawal transaction and sign that with the password?
Yeah, okay. So for example, I guess I have two things to say. So one is take cash, for example, right? Like cash is a lot more convenient than like a check, right? Because cash is what is called a bearer asset, right? It basically provides value to whoever owns it, whoever carries it, right? And there are, a lot more situations where you can use cash than where you can use like a check, right? So this is kind of like, we're kind of expanding the range of economic opportunities that we can accommodate by not requiring an identity to be associated with this bearer token, right? And like one kind of prime example of that is, say, a contract is willing, like let's say a principal deploys a contract, right? That is a bounty, right, for some work to get done. And whoever comes up with a proof of work, right, gets to withdraw the funds, right? But so you actually want this to be anonymous, right? You don't want the contract to say, oh, I'll only disperse the funds to one person, because as long as someone gets the job done, right, I'm willing to pay you for it, right? But then in a naive proof of work contract, right, like I'll do the work and then I get this proof of work token and I present it, right? But before my transaction lands, it gets sniped by a bot, and the bot didn't do any work but steal my proof of work, right? But then the bot gets the funds from the contract.
Okay, I'm like, with that example, I'm wondering, like, is this interfacing with a smart contract that's requesting this proof of work and that's distributing the funds?
Yeah, that's right.
So, like, I'm thinking, in practice, it seems you could maybe solve this by like getting the proof of work and putting that on, line 1, and getting your blockchain address and putting that on line 2, and then encrypting it and sending that through with the sort of public key of the smart contract that only it can decrypt.
So the thing is, right, smart contracts are just pieces of code, which are supposed to be able to be run by anybody, right? Like, Ethereum is this whole network of a bunch of different computers that know how to run, Ethereum virtual machine bytecode, right? And like, that's the whole point, right? That anyone can run it. It doesn't rely on a single trusted actor, right? However, there is a cryptographic solution that, could work in this case. There's a lot of active research in the crypto space on what are called zero knowledge proofs, which is kind of like in this case, instead of presenting the proof of work and your address, you can present a proof, which is some like sequence of bytes that can be checked and interpreted as saying, okay, this person has this transaction includes the correct proof of work, and it is associated with this address, without actually including the proof of work, right? And then with that, the the contract can then safely, or the legitimate claimant can safely make a claim, right? The thing with zero knowledge proofs is that they're like very mathematically / cryptographically advanced. And execution on the Ethereum blockchain is pretty expensive. Like I said, right? Even just deploying an instance of the Solomonic contract cost me 90 USD, right? So like running code is definitely not cheap, at least not on, Ethereum, right? Like there are a bunch of current gen blockchains that like are a lot like more high throughput, higher capacity, like super minimal transaction fees. But, unfortunately, people don't focus on those. They're just more concerned with, NFT drops and Dogecoin and whatever. Right. But anyway, right. So there's a cryptographic solution, but this is like a mechanism design solution, right?
Yeah.
Both of which, have their different pros and cons.
Okay.
Ooh, what do I see in the future for this? Any future progressions or uses? Yeah, I mean, so front running is just like an issue on the blockchain right now. Like there are tons of front running bots. They're constantly crawling the mempools, looking for opportunities to basically do this kind of attack. And it happens all the time. Like you can just scroll through Etherscan, which is the website that kind of shows you all the transactions on the Ethereum blockchain, and literally see instances where there are multiple transactions, hitting a contract, and like basically like the second person is like the person who actually initiated the transaction and wants to claim the funds, and deserves the funds, but then like some bot just like swooped in and took it, right? I mean, I don't want to get into the whole like, decentralized application because that's a whole another trip. But there are tons of people building these applications, right, on the blockchain, and they're all built up from smart contracts, right? And a big company might have the resources to hire engineers and smart contract developers to build systems that aren't susceptible to front running. But if you're just like a small company, right, or you're just like a small team trying to deploy something just to get something done, right, you may not have the expertise to be able to come up with an elaborate system, right? So the purpose of this paper is basically to introduce the idea that you can kind of just add this Solomonic clause to the contract. You have your contract and you augment it with, these couple lines of code. And then now it is safe against front-running attacks. Cool, thanks. Yeah, any other questions?
Just a quick question.
Yes.
Could bad internet ever be an opportunity for arbitrage in this situation?
Could bad internet ever be an opportunity for arbitrage? I don't know about arbitrage, but bad internet could definitely be.
Because we have NBN in this country, so I'm just talking about
yes.
The widespread adoption and
Yeah.
entry costs associated with this sort of thing.
Yeah. Entry costs. You mean the entry costs of
entry barriers,
using
whatever you want to call it.
Entry barriers to like begin using applications on the blockchain? Yeah. I mean, again, right, on a current gen blockchain, the like the architecture is good, the user experience is good. There's a lot of supporting kind of products that are built around it. So you can just basically create a wallet, right? Like you'll literally download the app from the app store or something, you can create a wallet, and then you can start making transactions at, like for example, we've you and I have talked about Algorand before. The transaction fee is like 1/10 of a cent, and it basically completes in like 5 seconds, right? But the
ETH? What about
ETH?
ETH?
ETH. Well, I mean, I've been talking about ETH this whole time, right? Like Ethereum was kind of like the big next step after Bitcoin, right? Because you moved up from just this payments ledger into a full like generalized computer, right? But unfortunately, Ethereum is also, a couple of generations behind now, right? There are newer blockchains with much more scalable architectures, higher capacity, lower transaction fees, shorter block times, right? Yeah. And also about the bad internet thing, that is an interesting kind of point at which this mechanism can fail, right? Let's say that the attacker ends up in last place, so they're in position to get the funds if nobody calls the abort function, right? And let's say that we're actually in the challenge stage, and then the legitimate claimant gets a blackout or something, right? Then they're not around to call the abort transaction, and then the attacker can actually get the fees or get the funds, right? So we don't want that happening. But that problem is actually really easy to solve, because all the legitimate claimant has to do is to deploy this separate smart contract that we've developed, which automates the whole process, right? So this smart contract will essentially play the strategy that we've outlined in this game, right? Like depending on which of these games we end up in, the smart contract will know what to do. And in fact, it might even be preferable for people to just do that in general, because then it is like very clear, right? It is publicly known to an attacker that that the legitimate claimant is going to play this strategy, right? And thus the attacker knows it's entirely impossible for them to get access to these funds, right? Because they can read the code of this kind of helper smart contract and see that, like, no matter how I want to attack this contract, your helper smart contract will basically block me, right?
I think there are some more questions in the chat if you check the
what
the
if
chat.
she just weakly preferred the baby and am not indifferent to half a baby? Can you explain that?
Don't worry about that one.
Okay. All right. Is that the one you're talking about? Okay, great. I mean, I'm happy to answer it if you clarified a bit. Okay. I think that's a no.
Backed out of this question.
All right. Jason Lam, what do you think?
What do I think? It's pretty
Yeah.
cool. That's pretty good. I think what I think during this, I thought if I knew there was like a multiple choice quiz on this at the end, I would be much more effective at paying attention, because I often find by this time of the day I can't keep up with the presentation. So you gotta quiz me.
That's quite reasonable. We can maybe look into moving it
Yeah,
in the day. Next time.
Induce some stress. So I pay attention. No, it's pretty cool though. I don't really know.
Okay.
Oh yeah, exactly. Everyone plays a Kahoot at the end. Yeah, I don't really know very much about blockchain though, so it's pretty cool to see.
Yeah. I mean, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them here.
Yes, no, I'll let you know.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah.